Oh boy, here we go. I've literally been putting this video off for years because the culture surrounding this game is just inordinately toxic relative to its actual quality. Right off the bat, let me just say that I'm not here to be an obnoxious contrarian, and I'm certainly not going to try and sell you on the idea that Other M is like the best game in the series or better than Prime or anything like that. I just want to talk about Other M in a vacuum and explore why the obscene levels of hatred that every aspect of it continues to receive more than a decade out from its launch are completely unwarranted. Is that okay? Can we be mature big boys about this, or are we gonna enter cancerous groupthink mode? I feel bad needing to ask this, but from what I've seen, nothing makes this fanbase devolve into a pack of feral Metroids like the mere suggestion that Other M isn't the gaming moral equivalent of torturing someone's family to death and forcing them to watch. Now, I'm going to start with the elephant in the room, because if I don't at least acknowledge the flaws I agree with, then nobody is going to be able to focus on anything else. The way I see it, Other M has only two major flaws, neither of which come anywhere near compromising the entire game for me, but seem to have caused the wider fanbase to shit the bed and become completely incapable of acknowledging the game's strengths for some reason. These two major flaws are the narrative and the less objective issue of the game's linearity. I say less objective because linearity isn't actually a flaw in a vacuum, but I'll come back to that shortly. On the subject of the narrative, there are basically two issues at play. The first is the level of involvement, and the second is the actual quality. Regarding level of involvement, this is very similar to linearity. It's not actually a flaw, it just goes against the prevailing fan expectations of the time. Metroid games have historically been known to invoke a quote-unquote feeling of isolation, a concept which has become such a buzzword that even the Nintendo Treehouse staff were cramming it into every other sentence when they demoed Metroid Samus Returns back at E3 2017, just to reassure everyone who was still attending therapy because of what Other M had done to their wife and kids all the way back in 2010. Personally, I, for one, have always felt that the majority of gaming experiences can only be enhanced by the presence of multiple characters and a developed narrative, especially in a universe as rich and ripe for fleshing out as Metroid's. Hell, Metroid Prime 1 almost had Samus doing actual bounty hunter things, and I don't think fans would have cried foul if another sentient human or two had appeared in that game as a result. While I will acknowledge that Prime 3 probably had the better balance of character company to time spent in isolation ratio, I don't think there's anything fundamentally wrong with what Other M was trying to do here. Again, Metroid Prime had already flirted with the idea of expanding the universe and adding characters back in Hunters and Corruption, so it's not like well-received precedent for this concept hadn't already been set. Anyway, the actual issue with Other M's narrative has always been its poor quality, and this is basically the only point I am going to concede to the religious haters of this game, so enjoy it. Yes, Other M's narrative is a mess, and it's full of plot holes that I'm not going to break down here because others have done this ad nauseum. That said, I do want to hit a couple of specific things because I want to add some perspectives to the discourse that people don't usually mention about them, so bear with me. First, let's talk Authorization. We all know this story. Other M decided to try being a bit more novel with its setup by having Samus actually begin the adventure with all of her upgrades intact and simply be artificially forced to turn them off until receiving permission to use them from a commanding officer. And yes, this was very poorly thought out. While definitely not the worst idea in the world on paper, there is no reason why Samus should be forced to obey these orders because she really is on the bottle ship as an independent party. She's not legally obligated to cooperate with Adam's squad on his terms. Additionally, the narrative justification for this decision is to prevent Samus from using her more explosive weapons in an environment that may or may not have stray survivors around any corner. The problem here, of course, is that half of Samus's power-ups are strictly utility or protection-oriented. There's no reason not to activate her Varia or gravity suits, or attachments like the grapple beam. They literally only protect her and harm no one. This whole setup is sloppy, plain and simple, and I admit that. Funnily enough, this actually ties into an earlier video of mine, which no one saw, link in the description, about the importance of framing in video games, and how poor framing can kill a player's motivation to do something they might otherwise enjoy, or in this case, just sort of ruin a good idea. So why do I bring this up? I will die on the hill that it's cool that Other M tried to do something other than Metroid's usual routine of either starting Samus with nothing and offering no justification for it, or starting her with like half of her shit and then having it punched out of her somehow during the prologue. I appreciate that they wanted to mix things up, and I respect that they tried. But by coming up with framing which failed so utterly to account for Samus's protective gear, they did far more damage to the player's mentality right out of the gate than they needed to. Everyone knows the infamous Samus turn on your various suit scene, and yes, moments like this only serve to make all parties involved look like smooth-brained, drooling idiots. And then, of course, there's the infamous Ridley PTSD scene, which I will always say was an incredible idea on paper, and viewed in a vacuum is actually really intense and well choreographed. Other M in general could be seen as a really cool character study on Samus's relationship to Ridley. If you think about it, she has a much more vulnerable and personal relationship with her arch-nemesis than any other Nintendo character. He literally did to Samus's family what Other M's haters seem to think the game did to their families. He murdered her birth parents in front of her while she was a child, and this has always been their canonical shared background. In my opinion, showing that Samus can be vulnerable and putting her in front of an adversary that makes her feel vulnerable isn't a fundamentally bad idea. Fans seem to have this gospel of Samus in their heads that she absolutely must be an 8-foot-tall, mute lunatic because that's what Prime did with her, and she had very little direct characterization prior to that. But who's to say she isn't mental monologuing the whole damn time in Prime, and we just aren't hearing it? I dislike the notion that a character can't be both stoic and sensitive at the same time. It's small-minded and reductive. People have layers. They're made up of paradoxes like this, and we all wear different masks in front of different people, to a degree. The issue with the Ridley PTSD scene is not that Samus isn't a cold-hearted machine, it's simply its place in the timeline. Even if we consider the Prime Saga an alternate canon, which I don't, by the way, I think it slides very cleanly in between Metroid 1 and 2, Other M takes place after Super Metroid. This means that Other M is at least the third time Samus has encountered this asshole since growing up. The fifth or so, if we do count Prime, and she's never broken down like this before. On top of that, this Ridley is a clone, and I think Samus knows this. Regardless, a sequence like this probably should have occurred either during the events of Metroid 1, since that's her first time seeing him post-family murder, or during whatever the very next encounter was, depending on canon, as I could have at least read that as a sort of desperate, why won't you stay dead sort of outburst. But placing this reaction this far into Samus's career and this many encounters in with him was just a bad choice, plain and simple, as much as I actually really like the scene conceptually. In fact, I think this scene makes particularly good use of the authorization concept, as hearing Adam desperately shouting at Samus to unlock her two most powerful firearms at the same time just to get her to snap out of her breakdown was really powerful, I felt. Also, I couldn't figure out where else to put this, but Ridley's Pokemon-esque evolution cycle was a really cool little twist, and anyone who says it isn't is just biased because Other M. You know you'd have eaten that shit up if it had been in Super Metroid or in Prime. Anyway, the last issue with the story that I want to touch on also ties back into framing. Prior to its release, Other M was advertised as being an exploration of Samus's past and backstory in a way no other entry had attempted, and while it did technically go about this more than any game preceding it, the complete omission of the Chozo was distracting, even to me, the whole way through. Not only do we not see a single scene of Samus interacting with her foster parents or immersed in their civilization during its prime, but the Chozo aren't even mentioned at any point. By all accounts, the backstory Other M gives us is really just further fleshing out Samus's history with Adam Malkovich, and the tidbits it adds are frankly extremely redundant and not particularly interesting. Metroid Fusion really did do more with less in this department. But here's the thing. We are well under halfway through this video, and I'm basically done discussing flaws now. The vast majority of what follows is going to be at worst neutral and at best complimentary. And to start with, even having said all that I just did, for all the moaning people do about the story, everyone seems to forget that the cutscenes themselves are still, to this day, some of the most well-produced in Nintendo's history. Many of the pre-rendered scenes are absolutely breathtaking, and even the in-engine ones are brimming with energy, thanks to the relatively elaborate cinematography. Say what you want about the script, but not a single one of these scenes was poorly or lazily produced. If you can turn the analytical part of your brain off for a little bit, and I know you can, then the cutscenes can still be a frankly delightful pace breaker, as they were intended. Seriously, if you've ever watched a bad anime, which is most of them, or animated film, but appreciated the animation quality nonetheless, then you have literally no excuse not to take these cutscenes for what they are and get swept up in the equal parts moody and exciting sci-fi spectacle. Unless you're, I don't know, no fun. Now, I want to briefly touch on linearity before I go full throttle into positives, but I don't have much to say about it. Look, let me level with you. I understand and acknowledge that game franchises have identities, and there are certain aspects of their design that are seen as central to that identity. Metroid did cut its teeth on semi-nonlinear exploration, and for many fans, that aspect of its design is central to its identity. But again, Metroid Fusion had already flirted with the idea of a somewhat more linear approach. Item acquisition in the Prime games has always been mostly linear, and even beyond all that, Metroid's identity has never really been non-linearity or a pure sense of isolation to me personally. To me, Metroid has always been Samus. I've been obsessed with Samus as a game character since before I even knew what Metroid was. I had never even heard of Metroid when I first saw Samus in the original Smash Bros. And instantly became hooked on her as a player avatar. The suit, the abilities. I remember being 6 years old and being told schoolyard rumors that Samus was a girl under the suit and being like, psh, nah, that can't be true. He's way too cool to be a girl. What I love about Samus as a game protagonist, personally, is that she's still one of a kind. She's this Kino sci-fi badass. She wears this wonderfully designed, cool as fuck battlesuit that has a bunch of unusual weapons and a bunch of weird as hell auxiliary features, like turning into a ball. I love seeing a suited up Samus on screen, and I love being put in control of this particular character with this particular arsenal. To me, the non-linear caverns of Zebes and Talon 4 aren't what Metroid is. Samus is what Metroid is. Metroid is Samus, and Samus is Metroid. And now, literally a Metroid. And frankly, as long as I'm playing as her, you can put me on fucking Isle Delfino, and I'll be a happy player. And this is the fundamental reason why I just don't care about the relative linearity of Other M. Because in terms of moment-to-moment gameplay, it gets Samus right. Should it have been more non-linear? Sure, but there's still plenty of exploration for hidden power-ups, and I, for one, don't mind not having to make a U-turn every 10 minutes for one game. Clearly, the semi-non-linear exploration is more important to the majority of the fanbase, and that is significant. It has value and needs to be acknowledged. But I need to stress that in a vacuum, linearity is not objectively bad design. It's apples and oranges. It's just a choice. It doesn't single-handedly render the whole product automatic dog shit or undermine everything else the game has to offer. If you didn't bitch about it in Fusion, you shouldn't be bitching about it here. And need I remind you again that power-up acquisition in Prime is also 99% linear! And speaking of the Samus experience, now I can start getting more into the things I really like about Other M. Right off the bat, I want to establish that I feel like Metroid's biggest curse is that during the transition to 3D, the macro and micro level elements of 2D Metroid got split down two different paths. That was a confusing way to word that, so let me explain. Metroid Prime inherited the macro elements of 2D Metroid's design. It's a less guided experience, and its world has a more open concept. It's still structured, mind you. It's by no means open world, and the sequence breaking it allows for relies on glitches for the most part. But it has that somewhat less linear world design. It also has that more pronounced sense of isolation, which is again less important to me than simply playing as Samus and having a fleshed out world, but it's clearly important to the majority of the fanbase. Having said all that, Other M inherited the micro elements of 2D Metroid's design, by which I mean the feel and pace of the moment-to-moment gameplay. Metroid Prime games are experienced in first person, and the pacing is, for lack of a better word, somewhat more plodding. Samus feels like RoboCop. She trudges forward slowly, she's less acrobatic. The game encourages you to stop moving every 5 seconds to scan things. Other M, on the other hand, feels like the more authentic translation of a 2D Metroid game into 3D in terms of the perspective and the way Samus handles. She's swift again, she's acrobatic. Hell, she does those aerial somersaults whenever she jumps. Does that mean nothing to you people? And the scan visor doesn't exist, so you can take in atmosphere as you go, but you're not contractually obligated to stop and smell the roses so much as run past them and keep zapping aliens in the face. Even after all these years, it remains interesting to me that players noticed Prime's macro-level similarities to 2D Metroid without even acknowledging Other M's micro-level ones, which to me feel less subtle and more obvious because they affect the moment-to-moment game feel rather than the game's skeletal design documents. I happen to prefer third-person games to first-person games as well, although that's strictly a personal taste thing. If I like a character's design, if I think it's cool or appealing or whatever, then I like seeing them on screen. For me, Other M was the long-awaited realization of that 2-second clip of Samus fighting Ridley back in Melee's opening. The look and feel of 2D Metroid truly converted into a 3D environment with omnidirectional movement. And don't get me wrong, I still love Metroid Prime, and I acknowledge that it has better, more cohesive fundamental design while still feeling true to Metroid's traditions. But sometimes I don't want to feel like RoboCop. Sometimes I don't want to slowly trudge forward and scan everything. Sometimes I just want to feel like Samus. Sometimes I just want to play 2D Metroid in 3D. And to date, Other M is still the only product in existence that allows me to fulfill that desire. Also, Samus's design is just way too fucking cool to be shoving me behind her visor. I'm sorry. It doesn't prevent me from enjoying Prime by any means, and I agree that there's a different flavor of cool energy behind feeling like you're inside her power suit, but I just like seeing my digital action figure on screen. What can I say? It does contribute to my preference for 2D Metroid. On top of that, I love how Samus's suit design in Other M maintains the bulk from Super Metroid while somehow still being slicker than ever. Of course, I love the power suit's design in Prime as well, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't get some small amount of spiteful pleasure from the fact that Other M's has been the model used in the past 2 Smash games, despite everyone else's wildly undeserved disdain for its game of origin. And now I want to talk about Other M's more unusual mechanical divergences, because this is a topic I feel very passionate about, and I am convinced gets exponentially more hatred than it deserves, simply because of the mob mentality surrounding this game's general reception. First of all, despite what I just said about the third-person aspect, I actually really enjoy the first-person component of Other M. I think its handling was so unique and creative, and when it's firing on all cylinders, it feels so visceral to plant your feet and fire off some heavy ordnance from a different perspective. Again, almost no other game does this, and to me, it's one of those concepts that embodies peak outside-the-box Japanese game design philosophy. Now, I acknowledge that in execution, this mechanic came out a bit clunky, with the need to reorient yourself upon entering first person if you're not careful, but harpooning the very concept just because this take was a bit clunky is ridiculous to me. I know the gaming community knows how to separate ideas from execution because I see it all the time. Why does only Other M just have these 2 factors inextricably welded together and then dumped wholesale into the trash heap when it comes to online discourse? This double standard that's been held for nearly 15 years now is juvenile and ridiculous, and frankly, you should be embarrassed if you perpetuated it. I also really liked the alternate take on ammo and energy recharge. I don't have a lot to say about this, but I thought it was a really cool twist on the old system that was more immersive than organic life forms just dropping health and ammo pickups when they die. This is another thing that I genuinely think only gets shit on because people enjoy shitting on the game itself. You know, everyone's so gung-ho about Prime's immersive atmosphere, and yet no one has anything to say when an oversized bug inexplicably drops an actual missile when it dies, like we're in some kind of 80s arcade world. I don't know. I personally think there's a good idea here that even Prime could benefit from. Same with no longer having to shoot doors to open them. That's always been insanely stupid and immersion-breaking in the 3D entries. Are you telling me everyone on the GFS Olympus carries around a blaster to open the door to the bathroom? And as for limiting health regeneration, this is bad. Why? I thought you people liked having a challenge. Guess you Prime purists are all just a bunch of casuals. And don't even try the if enemies don't drop pickups, then why should you fight them argument. That shit was always flimsy. By your logic, why should you fight enemies in any game that isn't an RPG and doesn't lock you in a room with them? Why should Mario or Link fight enemies? They don't give you XP or worthwhile drops. You should fight the enemies in all these games because A, it's fun, and B, they're aggressive, and you need to get them out of your hair if you're going to comb the area for the worthwhile collectibles or get to the next area without them taking potshots at you. Do I really need to explain this? Anyway, I also like a lot of other little controversial touches, like the gravity suit just adding a purple aura to the various suit this time around. This is another side tangent, but color is a big part of a character's design, just as much as shape. I've always found things like shiny Pokemon and rare color variants of things to be about as overhyped as Other M is overhated. While the odd shiny Pokemon variant can look cool, frankly, I think that most of them just look worse. There's a reason that the core designs use the colors that they do. Lucario's actual design is that he's blue. Making him yellow doesn't make him cooler. Purple Zoroark does look alright, but frankly, I prefer the red. Celebi is green rather than pink by default because of its connection with nature. You get the idea. My point is that Samus's power suit was really designed with the various suits' color scheme in mind. The purple paint job on the gravity suit is admittedly iconic at this point, but frankly, it just looks worse than the various suit. So for me, the purple aura used over the suit's actual design colors in Other M strikes a very nice middle ground. I do think that Mercury Steam have perfected the gravity suit by actually altering its shape as well and adding other visual highlights, but in a pre-Mercury Steam world, I'll take Other M's gravity aura over the lazy purple grimace suit any day. And what's not to like about Samus's stylish finishers in Other M, exactly, Everyone's always so eager to embody the spirit of RoboCop when it comes to slowly tromping around, but when it comes to swinging fools around by the tail or hopping on their heads and blasting them at point-blank range, everybody sleeps. Or says it's totally stupid and doesn't even contain the kernel of a good idea because Other M did it, so even the idea itself must automatically be shitty. I personally love these close quarters additions to combat. Overblast and Lethal Strike are just as visceral as planting your feet to fire off missiles in first person when you get to pull them off. Now, could the mechanic be improved and made somewhat more skill-based? Sure, absolutely. But it's never going to be, because for a decade and a half, nobody has been able to make the mental leap that good ideas with sloppy execution can be improved upon. When it comes to Other M, the mindless NPC mob mentality is so strong that everyone just throws the baby out with the bathwater every single time! And in the end, that's really what this all comes down to. What saddens me most about Other M is that it had something to offer the franchise that nothing else did. It was flawed. It was misguided in some areas, but it was fast-paced and fun to play on a moment-to-moment basis in a way that, frankly, even Prime could learn something from. It has some of the most intense combat in the franchise, some fun-as-hell bosses, and if you tell me that endlessly circle-strafing with lock-on in Prime is categorically better and there's no place for at least some of the ideas that Other M brings to the table, I'm just going to laugh at you. People complain about the soft auto-aim in Other M like it's somehow more brain-dead than locking on in Prime 1 and 2, or aiming a beam that's just as tall and wide as Samus herself and firing it through walls at enemies who can't return fire in 2D Metroid. Like, you can't convince me that the line you've drawn here isn't completely arbitrary. Anyway, the truth is, I'm kind of out of things to compliment specifically because what remains is just pure, undiluted, classic Metroid gameplay. It doesn't need defending because it's exactly the same shit you love and praise everywhere else. Exploring, fighting, getting upgrades that simultaneously open up more of the world and give you more options in combat. It's all here, and for the most part, it literally plays like 2D Metroid in 3D with a couple of interesting wrinkles. The environments may not be as pretty as those in Prime, but they still have that sterile, derelict space station atmosphere. The classic Metroid baddies are all here, reimagined in 3D. The space pirates are far more accurate to their 2D variants, but nobody ever acknowledges this. Movement is fast and fluid, combat is fun, and Samus's kit is all present and accounted for, including the speed booster, and just as fun to use as ever for both combat and exploration. You know, people like to claim there's no exploration in Other M because the trek through the bottle ship is linear, but there's plenty of exploration to uncover hidden power-ups and find the way forward within the larger rooms and biomes themselves. You still explore, it's just been recontextualized a little bit. I'm not even that smart. How am I the only person to notice this? In fact, speaking of recontextualized exploration, I've been saving this point for the perfect moment, and it's gonna blow your mind wide open. Check it. There is an entire 50% of the Metroid experience that Other M nails. You know what it is? It's called actually doing things inside the rooms. Like, you do realize that there's more to Metroid's design than just the macro-level maze exploration, right? If navigating the maze is the only thing that's important to you, then might I recommend one of those little pen and paper mazes from the kids menu at Denny's. That might be more up your alley than any Metroid game, and your wallet will certainly thank you. Also, the sense of isolation is incredible. After all, there are no silly things like characters or story to break your immersion and bog down the experience. Which reminds me, people also like to say that Other M demolishes any sense of isolation because there are other characters in it. Let me ask you a question. How often Do you actually encounter Adam's crew or have any sort of in-game backup? How often? Again, these moments are the exception to the rule. You have backup for the prologue boss. That's it! Adam's troops are there when Second Evolution Ridley attacks and don't even help because they're occupied with other hostiles, and Anthony appears on like 2 other occasions. Oh, and Samus briefly chats with MB at some point. Excuse me. There's still not a single moment of thorough, direct, in-game backup, and not a single escort mission to be found. This is a 6 to 8 hour game, guys. You're really gonna claim that it has no sense of isolation? That Samus is never by herself? Jesus, what do you people need her to be in a sensory deprivation tank to meet her isolation quota? Why do you even care about Dread's cliffhanger ending at this point? Who gives a shit? We don't need characters or world building in Metroid. Let's just keep sticking Samus on deserted planets with no dialogue for 100% of every game's runtime. Fuck it! And I'm not even sure what else to say at this point, because when I see a lot of the criticism for Other M, I'm convinced we're simply not even playing the same game. You ever see one of those reviews where all the reviewer does is shit on the game, but every second of footage just looks super fun to you? That's what being an Other M fan is like, in a nutshell. There is so much fun to be had here, and if the cutscenes bother you so much, then just skip them! Like, wow, what a concept! I know they're unskippable on a first run, and that's not great, but if you're this staunchly opposed to Other M, then that means you've played it before, right? I mean, surely you wouldn't seriously still be bitching and moaning this fiercely after all this time if you hadn't even played the damn thing to begin with. So this should be a non-issue for you from now on. Now, are the Variasuit and Wavebeam acquisition sequences still dumb as shit? Yes, but they're 2 tiny sequences. They don't undermine the whole rest of the product. Do the sequences where the camera pulls in close and you slowly walk forward kind of suck? Yes, but again, there's like 2 of them, and they last 2 minutes a pop. Same for the Where's Waldo moments, which last literally 2 seconds once you know what to do. Again, they don't undermine the whole rest of the experience. Get over it! Collectively, all those moments I just mentioned encompass like 1% of the game's runtime. They're moments. It's like the game gave you 10 Papercuts and you're acting like a big rig slammed into you at 80 miles an hour. If the Papercuts bother you, that is understandable, but your reaction does not match the severity of the injury. Hell, the artifact hunt of Prime 1 alone lasts far longer than the entire collection of these moments in Other M, and yet nobody seems to think that sequence completely ruins the entire experience. I guess ultimately, my point is that Metroid Other M didn't put the franchise on ice for a decade. Your overreaction to it did. And a handful of somewhat clunkily executed ideas and quality-neutral design decisions that you just don't like don't invalidate the rest of what the game gets right, which is plenty. So look, is Other M flawed? Yes, of course it is. What game isn't? Is Other M better than Prime? No. But is it an irredeemable dumpster fire from the ground up without even a single morsel of a good idea? Or is its execution so sloppy and its fundamental design so broken that you'd have better luck salvaging fun gameplay from some mobile freemium shovelware trash? Is it a top-to-bottom betrayal of everything Metroid is and was before it, whose atmosphere and moment-to-moment gameplay in no way resemble earlier entries? Hell no, and how dare you even suggest that? Personally, I'd kill for another stab at this style of Metroid game, or at least a remaster. I think it has so much potential, and genuinely feels like the more authentic transformation of 2D Metroid into 3D than Prime ever did in terms of micro-level, moment-to-moment gameplay. Getting so butthurt by the narrative and the linear design that you throw the baby out with the bathwater and never even consider re-examining your opinion after nearly 2 decades is just such a nonsense, brain rot approach to games critique, and I really don't understand why it just somehow became acceptable with Other M, when there are actual full-on factions of people out there defending way shittier games. Case in point, Now that Metroid is finally experiencing a bit of a renaissance, people are slowly coming back to Federation Force and talking about how it's actually pretty good if taken on its own terms. Now, I'm all about taking games on their own terms and judging them for what they are rather than what they aren't. Believe me. Hell, I love me some Star Fox Adventures, and I have majorly come around on Banjo-Kazooie nuts and bolts in the years since its initial release. But again, to hate on Other M this mindlessly while starting to take a more balanced stance on Federation Force is utterly absurd to me. What a ridiculous double standard. Other M, the game where you play as Samus with normal proportions in relative isolation, using all her classic abilities while exploring a single, cohesive environment, is somehow the unforgivable sin of the Metroid series, but the Prime spin-off in which you planet hop through linear levels while playing as a chibi battle mech inhabited by an even more super-deformed bobblehead man and fight a brainwashed, supersized, chibi bobblehead Samus locked in Morph Ball mode as the final boss is okay now? Where are you people drawing the line here? Whether you come to Metroid for exploration or for Samus, newsflash, Federation Force doesn't give you either. Look, all I'm trying to say is, if you love Other M like I do, love it proudly. If you hate Other M like 99.99% of the fanbase, hate it. But for the love of God, stop trying to gaslight the rest of us into believing it's this Superman 64 level dumpster fire shovelware nightmare with no polish and zero redeeming qualities that doesn't deserve to be acknowledged or remembered. Because I am sorry, but that is just not fucking true. Almost every single revisit video it has received in the last 5 years have been completely riddled with obvious surface-level confirmation bias. You are looking at it through shit-tinted glasses. Okay, just calm down, put the glasses back in the drawer, reflect, and compare this game to products that actually match what you're describing. Because they do exist, and Other M is absolutely, categorically, not one of them. Not even close. At worst, Other M is like a bad Pixar movie. It's still a Pixar movie, bro. It's a 7 out of 10 Metroid if you just love stopping to scan things every 5 seconds and think that basic circle strafing with lock-on is peak combat design, and at least an 8 out of 10 game no matter who you are. And hey, if you still completely and utterly disagree with me on all of this and think there's a reason I'm in the minority amongst Metroid fans, then just think of me as a shiny variant. I'm rarer, and therefore automatically better and cooler and more desirable, right? Food for thought. In the meantime, I'll just be over here capping off my latest 3D Metroid marathon with yet another thoroughly enjoyable playthrough of Other M. Peace out. Hey guys, if you're hearing this, thanks for sticking around all the way to the end. You're the real ones. If you're still subscribed after I just publicly debased myself by committing the humiliating, unforgivable sin of claiming that Other M isn't objectively the worst piece of media ever conceived and is in fact better than Metroid Prime Pinball, then you're extra real. Sorry if this came off a little dramatic. I've basically been sitting on these feelings for 14 years. If you're new here, I promise that the vast majority of my videos aren't this charged, but a large part of this channel's brand, as I see it, is putting into words these kinds of undervoiced and underrepresented opinions. So, if that sounds up your alley, hey, go ahead and subscribe. There's more to come. And of course, as always, thanks for watching.